Lead balloons.
It's the alchemy of
Unpopular opinions. So,
whoops, I have somewhere to be.
there's actually bourbon in this, so everyone knows.
Those things are very complicated and
I don't know that I actually believe what I'm about to say.
spreading lies
This critical culture that we live in.
just to try to be an asshole.
Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another episode of Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. T-Dog, how you doing, my friend?
Quite well, buddy. Very good to see you. Very good to be doing this thing. Let's get after it. And let's get some. Let's win the day, as they say. Let's win the day.
Do this like Brutus, because you know we ain't new to this. AKA
Work the shoulders.
DC
Work
Talk.
the shoulders.
All right, so
Okay.
Trent, you remember the old cartoon, The Flintstones? Right, what do you remember about it?
Fred and Wilma, stone. I remember vehicles that they pedaled with their feet, that they moved with their feet. Stone, the stone wheels, the crazy garb, the clubs, the neckties. Not very much more than that. And
Sure.
I remember that Fruity Pebbles is my favorite cereal. That's about as far as it goes with me. Yeah. How about yourself?
I mean, that's solid. I think you caught all the highlights. I just love the idea of living harmoniously with dinosaurs. I think that's maybe one of my favorite things about the Flintstones. But I think it's fair to say the Flintstones, in terms of prehistoric history of humanity, isn't a documentary, right? Think of the stereotype of a caveman. What do you think of if I were to call someone a caveman?
Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is Geico, right? I mean, so simple. A caveman could do it. I mean, they hook into at least that sense that there might be cavemen out there who are a little offended by the way that we regard them as simplistic. But they're actually onto something with that, Joel, because but when we think about prehistory, it's this huge period of time, and what we decide to do, rather than imagining it as sort of this super complex, really interesting period of time, we just imagine that for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years, human beings were just sort of one kind of thing doing one thing. So there were cavemen living in caves, eating meat, killing people. That's basically it.
Yeah.
That's all that human beings were interested in doing and all they got up to. It could be the caveman. It could be the guy hunting the Siberia, the saber-toothed tiger. It could be hunters and gatherers out there roaming in nomadic bands. It's this simplistic way of seeing it. I'm not sure why we do it, but we always think that way when we think about prehistory. Nothing really interesting started happening until like Egypt, I guess.
Yep. I tend to see what you're talking about, the nuances, because maybe, just maybe, our prehistoric ancestors weren't as dopey and animalistic as the stereotypes say. So, everyone, this is another installment of our favorite books. And we're going to be highlighting one from Trent. It's called The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. David Graeber is an anthropologist and a lot of activism in his work, in his life, and David Wengrow is an archaeologist. So, Trent, give us a brief elevator pitch of this book and why it is one of your favorite books.
Okay, yeah, I mean, a brief elevator pitch for I think it's like a 500-600 page book with extensive endnotes. But if I could home in on sort of the main thesis of the book, and that is this, Joel, that the dominant myths or narratives of human progress, of human regress, even these dominant myths that we've come to get used to as a society, according to Graeber and Wengrow, are wrong. The dominant myths are wrong of how we have evolved to where we're at today, and that our human history and our human futures maybe more playful and experimental than we've allowed in the past. That's basically what they're getting after in the book, that we've understood the world and we understand it currently in too simplistic of ways. And there's much more interesting, intriguing ways of seeing it that could be very fruitful and productive for the discussions that we have about politics, about sociology, about families, about sex, about building culture, aesthetics, all these kinds of things. Why is it one of my favorite books? Well, I love David Graeber. I don't know much about Wengrow, but I've seen a bunch of like Graeber's YouTube videos. He died, I think, in 2020 or 2021, I believe, from COVID. But he wrote. I mean, he's a great sort of incendiary writer. He wrote Bullshit Jobs back in 2018, which is hilarious and very informative. But I like how this book, it combines extensive masterful knowledge, genuine curiosity, not that we know everything, but we're learning. That's what their perspective is, that curiosity, that joy in writing that I think is pretty abundant. You see there's this excitement about what they're doing, and also courage to challenge the standard narratives, and to look at evidence, some new, some that's been around for a long time, and question it and present it to the world in a way that could get them, probably not killed, but could get them in hot water, get them in trouble, these kinds of things. So, and also the other thing, Joel, that I'd say is that they contrary to a lot of the people that you might read who like to pontificate on like evolutionary psychology, and these guys have the rare distinction of actually appearing to have read more than one book on this topic. So anytime I read a book and it's clear that the person has actually read more than one book, man, I perk up. I get excited.
So you're actually listening and reading someone who isn't just regurgitating something that happens to align with their personal opinions, like a YouTuber or a podcaster that wants to tell some like simplistic story about the history of what it means to be masculine. Here we have a book that has some nuance and doesn't necessarily come at you with dogma of like, here's what you ought to believe. It's like, here's the evidence. Let's consider what is possible. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. They even, I think, use the language at some point in the book. They say we're inviting the discussion. That's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to steer the discussion in different directions than it's been in the past. And here's the evidence. We're going to get even more, but they've said we're at a point in time where we have access to so much great information, more and more information about human prehistory. And if we can tap into it, it could really, because everyone says things like we have to learn about history so we don't repeat it, it's like we learn about history so we don't repeat the mistakes. Well, let's learn about history then. Let's learn about all of it and dive in. And they're encouraging us to have that discussion,
because some of it may be desirable to repeat. All right,
some of it may be very. That's right. Yeah.
So the book argues that there are these two philosophers, right? Rousseau and Hobbes. And I love anytime Hobbes is referenced, mostly because my favorite comic is Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin is named after one of our earlier podcasts, Calvin's God is a Dick, John Calvin. And Hobbes is named after Thomas Hobbes, a famous philosopher. Yeah. So anyways, these two philosophers who established two kind of anachronistic stories of humanity that still live with us. So can you introduce us to these philosophers, what they believed, and why these stories are misleading and or unhelpful?
Right. Well, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the Swiss philosopher who I believe wrote in French in the 18th century. And Rousseau actually was, I think, invited to enter some kind of essay contest. And he wrote an essay sort of on the origins of inequality. And in this essay, it's very interesting because he even kind of states that he's kind of doing a thought experiment, that he doesn't expect his readers to imagine that the world that he's sort of assuming existed in exactly that form, but he sort of looks into the biblical story, the biblical idea of the fall from grace, the departure from Eden, or sort of original sin. He envisions a time when human beings were living sort of in this solitary state of innocence, and they were living very simplistically. There wasn't a lot of like cultural reflection, these kinds of things, and then we eventually, gradually, we fell from that when we started to acquire property, when we started to practice agriculture, these kinds of things. And as our lives got more complex, then there emerged hierarchies and competition and aggression and violence and domination and subordination. There's that famous phrase he's known for: "Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains." And this has become a very popular story that we've sort of imbibed and taken. A lot of people relate well to this story and think, yes, there was that time when we were in perfection, and then we lost it, and we had this sad thing happen 5,000 years ago called agriculture, and everything since then has been a sad story. These are the people that kind of lament civilization, that want us to go back to the paleo days and wear loincloths and run around and live simplistically. And not that might be better, but this has been one of the main stories. It's a very simplistic story. It's a very limited story.
You made me think of like the dudes who like watch Walking Dead, and they're like, why can't the world collapse where I can just be an animal with a shotgun? So like,
yes, right, exactly. And then this kind of there's a hopefulness, but there's also a cynicism there, because it's like, we've lost it, man. It's over. We're done, and we can't, until we can get back into tribes of about 50 to 150 people and live simply. We're fucked.
Yeah.
And Graeber and Wengrow make the argument that that's not the case. Okay, so then we have Thomas Hobbes, who was writing in the mid-1600s or mid-17th century, and he's famous for one of his books, Leviathan. And in Leviathan, there's this famous phrase that he has that he assumes that human beings, in our infancy, in our beginning stages, that we lived lives that were solitary, nasty, poor, brutish, and short. Solitary, nasty, poor, brutish, and short.
Brutish.
Well, a quick segue on this phrase. One of my favorite books is by a guy named Christopher Ryan. It's called Sex at Dawn, and it's a consideration of how human beings, how we're wired sexually, and how we might have existed sexually in times past, and even in hunter-gatherer tribes today, and so on and so forth. But he basically, Christopher Ryan in that book, contests every single one, I think successfully, of Hobbes' assumptions about how human beings were in prehistory. But actually, Ryan is someone who, in my mind, is kind of follows that Rousseauian trajectory, which is to say, oh no, because we were all living as hunter-gatherers, and so we were communal, right? So not solitary. We didn't fight as much as is assumed. We weren't nasty. We weren't poor, because poverty is kind of a social construct. We weren't brutish. And lives weren't necessarily particularly short. That there was tons of infant mortality, and so human beings lived normal lifespan. Anyway, he contests, I think, successfully. But the point being that there are people out there today, thinkers like Steven Pinker, who wrote a book called Better Angels of Our Nature, and there are others who basically, their idea is that sort of with the advent of more and more technology, with the advent of the Enlightenment and the propagation of some of the ideals of Western civilization throughout the world, that human beings, that the world has been getting safer and safer and better. We have these hierarchies that we may not all love, but they sort of restrain those Hobbesian dark impulses that we have, so that we continue to grow. And they have this very rosy view of sort of this linear upward progress that human beings are making, and it should continue unimpeded as long as we're all well educated and well read, and come up with better and better ways of sort of restraining that desire to sort of dismember each other and cannibalize one another. So there you go. That's sort of my encapsulation. It's very important because these are two of the very dominant sort of philosophical approaches of human evolution and cultural evolution, how we got to where we are, and whether or not we can do anything about it. I mean, if we've fallen from grace and agriculture has ruined us and these private property and these kinds of things, there's nothing we can do except go back to that. And if it's a Hobbesian situation, well, when we were sort of roaming around as hunters and gatherers, we didn't sort of have a clue and we were just killing each other. And now with the Enlightenment and with all the improvements that we made, there's nothing really new that can happen. We just need to keep sort of doing what we're doing. They're very simple. They're very limited understandings of what human beings were up to back then and what human beings could be up to in the future.
That's a brilliant synopsis. If I can just offer, just kind of listening to you and having, I did not read the whole book. I read The Blinkist, right? So I listened to the summaries.
I'm very proud of you, Joel. Yeah,
I did it twice, and I read a couple articles about the book. So, but like hearing you kind of talk about those, I kind of see two pairs of rose-colored glasses, and that we might see at least in the American political system. The conservatives put on the Rousseau rose-colored glasses, and just like, it's like we need to go back, conserve. Like the idea of conservative is to conserve this almost like this imagined history of when things were more innocent and things were pure and not so tainted. And then the other pair of rose-colored glasses are put on by the more liberals, where they use words like progressive. We have progressed. We've been marching forward up and to the right, as you say. This onward march of civilization is actually a good thing, because deep down we're just a bunch of animals, and we need the government to make more structure for us to thrive. Is that a fair way to apply that?
I think that's roughly. I think you've hit on some good things there. The way that I would take some of what you said, though, is I would say, like with respect. I thought about this with sort of our tendencies with sort of this binary thing with conservatives and liberals. One of the things I think is interesting when I talk with some conservatives is I'll try to introduce an idea of how we could change things politically. And granted, I go far out there because I sort of live in this world of this book, and I look at all the ways that we existed as human beings, and not all of them, of course, are going to be as feasible. But I look at the possibilities that we have, and so I'll talk with some of my friends, some of my conservative friends, about, hey, what if we lived in this way and did this thing? And they're always like, well, I can't imagine a scenario where that would work. I can't imagine how that would be practical, these kinds of things. I'm like, well, not being, as Graeber and Wengrow say, not being able to imagine how something might work is not an argument. It just simply is a lack of imagination.
Yeah.
That's not to say I can't imagine it is not a way to argue against something. It's simply an admission that you lack imagination. I think what's interesting. So when I'm talking to them, I'm sort of presenting I'm asking us to imagine. So I'm asking us to use what they discuss in this book, which is actuarial intelligence, which they maintain human beings appear to have had for as long as we've been around. And that is the ability to think about what would be alternatives if we were to do something in an alternative way or organize ourselves alternatively. What would be the possible outcomes of those? That's actuarial intelligence, right? So if I change X, A, B, and C, what could X, Y, and Z be? And so anyway, that's just the world of imagination. But it's really interesting when I talk with conservatives. Oftentimes, I might criticize aspects of the so-called aspects of capitalism that I see as problems, and they'll say things like, well, Trent, if we were, or if you could imagine that we were living in a truly free market where people could move freely to, if this job didn't work out, they could very easily move to another one, and companies could compete freely. I'm like, amazing how conveniently you get to tap into the imagination when I start critiquing capitalism. But when I want to employ the imagination to imagine a scenario, you say, well, I couldn't ever imagine that. But I can sure imagine what pure free market capitalism would look like. Even though we've never had it, they just love to imagine. I'm just saying, let's do more of that imagining. That's great. You can imagine that. Let's imagine other things too. And I'll shut up here in a second. I get excited, but like Graeber and Wengrow make the point that human beings for long periods. I think you'll prompt me to go into some specific examples, but there are in this book they introduce so much evidence of human societies throughout the centuries and the millennia that were very self-conscious politically, and weren't just roaming around in loincloths, that were building great monuments and organizing themselves in large cities well before we imagined that people should be forming cities. We thought that came well after established agricultural revolution. Building cities and coming together and building great monuments and burial sites and temples and all kinds of things that they shouldn't be doing, that human beings were doing back then. It's just so much more interesting than sort of our simplistic notions of things.
Yeah, and I feel like you kind of touched on something. It almost sounded like dogmatic imagination. People tend to only we're limited to the things that we want to see, and I can't think of a sadder imagination than to only imagine what I want versus imagine what is possible. And someone who can't imagine what's possible, but only imagines what they like want from their eyes, their like present desires, sounds like a prisoner to me. Like their imagination is in shackles. And so what this book seems to be calling for is, what if what we see inside of the horse blinders is not even remotely close to what is possible? Not to say that the things outside the blinder are true and right, we should go that direction, but at least put those in on the menu when we decide. That's really what I hear is kind of being argued here. And one of the most important points that the book seems to make is that perhaps the political situation that we find ourselves in, the state of our statehood, and when you read history about the formations of things like government and state and these kinds of ideas, it doesn't have to be permanent. That's one of the arguments. It's like we're not like stuck here. Whether we're trying to paint the evolution of politics as evil and like not desirable, as the Rousseau narrative might say, or as the glory of God, as the Hobbes narrative might say, like we're progressing with each step towards heaven, heaven on earth. History isn't marching like that in that direction, or it isn't all bleak. So archaeological records show that sometimes history's moved forward, backwards, sideways, or stood still. And in essence, our situation where we're at right now isn't a necessary product of the past. So, can you speak more to what I have a sense of what they're trying to evoke or invite us into?
Yeah. So on this concept of progress and sort of in within the context of like human evolution, cultural evolution, I mean, Graeber and Wengrow, they refer to a philosopher, I believe, again from the 18th century, I believe by the name of Turgot. And Turgot sort of became this champion of this sort of notion of this inexorable sort of unstoppable human march towards progress. And I think one of the things to be said is that evolution is not necessarily progress or the best. It's adaptation. It's adaptation to the stresses of an environment, and it's luck, It's randomness a lot of times. Sometimes it's conscientious reaction to things at a more cultural level. But in terms of just like biological evolution, it's random mutations, natural selection. So it's just it's not necessarily that our society is better. We've progressed. We've responded to certain stresses and certain challenges in certain ways. We could have responded in different ways. But what happens in the conversation a lot of times, Joel, is that people sort of imagine that sort of where we've arrived at right now in sort of this neoliberal milieu in the early 21st century is sort of, it's where it was always going. It had to have gone this way. It was destined for this. I think one of the really exciting things that they discuss in the book is that when you study human history, when you go into so-called human prehistory, you discover that societies have the capacity to make conscious decisions about how they organize themselves. And this is sort of against this concept. I'm going to get a little bit academic here, hopefully not boring, but there's a concept of sort of like ecological determinism. And as I understand it, basically means sort of like you can sort of, if you know enough about how a group of people who are situated in a particular place in the globe, a desert or a Nile Delta or a mountainous area, a swampy area, whatever it is, you can sort of predict the kind of people that they're going to become and how they're going to be politically. And that there's also, there's obviously limitations that people are going to run up against when they're in a certain niche, but they're going to, there is the capacity for making decisions. And so what's really interesting, the Graeber and Wengrow talk about these tribes that are in sort of like were in northwestern California, and I think this was at least 1,000 years ago, and maybe farther back. But there were two groups of people in what's modern day Northwest California. They were in a very similar ecological environment, probably eating a lot of the same food and facing a lot of the same challenges, and yet they organized themselves in very different ways. One of the tribes, they took slaves. Those who were not the slaves, unsurprisingly, did not work very hard, placed a high premium on luxury and sort of opulence and all these kinds of things. A neighboring tribe not too far away that would have had some kind of contact with this tribe, if not intimate knowledge of this tribe, chose a very different way of approaching their environment. They had kind of almost like a Protestant work ethic. They put a high premium on sort of like handicrafts and producing amazing things and working as hard as you could. These were both what we would call primitive peoples who were making decisions, and this process of sort of doing things in contradistinction to your neighbors is something that Graeber and Wengrow describe as schismogenesis. It's schism being sort of the split, right, and genesis being the origin. So where do divides come from? And it's this sort of thing. You hear about this. There was a group in the Amazon that they use canoes, but they don't build canoes. They either barter with neighboring tribes to the tribe that makes them, or they just steal them. But when they're interviewed, they're like, why don't you guys make canoes? You know how to make canoes. And they're like, well, we're so-and-so people group. We don't make canoes. So you're like, okay, you don't? And then you look at that and you're like, wait a minute, we do a lot of that stuff today. Yeah. I mean, if you look at so many Christian denominations, let's say, well, we worship on Saturday. Well, we have midweek services and Sunday. Well, we speak in tongues. We don't speak in tongues. We drink wine. And it's like all these groups, they're divided by just sort of like, we're going to be the group that doesn't do this thing. But the larger point going back to these tribes in sort of Northwest California is that human beings can be as Graeber and Wengrow make the point, human beings can be in very similar ecological environments and make very different decisions. So to suggest that, well, we're living in the 21st century and we have these problems and we live in this and we're faced by these things. And so the only way that we can respond to it is sort of this particular economic system and this social arrangement, is simply to not be aware of the ways that we've encountered challenges and dealt with our environment in the past millennia of our existence.
I like that. I think that's a powerful challenge to what I feel like has happened for me in the past 10 years, is to find the wisdom in our ancient past. There's so many answers to questions that are modern that I find have been explored throughout the centuries through various cultures, people groups that are what we would call ancient. Even like as in corporate America, people talking all about like mindfulness and like what happens if we like calm the brain down and we just like get into a meditative state and helping regulate our nervous. And we have all these like modern scientific terms, but it's just like, yeah, you dudes are finding out what religion is known for like literally centuries, maybe millennia.
Yes. Yeah,
maybe
right.
millennia. Just oh, you mean the thing that like monks and nuns and different religious leaders have been doing since before we knew what genes and atoms and whatever were? Like, yeah, some of this wisdom has been around a very, very, very long time. And the fact that we're just over here going like, we found it. It's like, no, you didn't. Like, it's just because you wrapped it differently doesn't mean the banana isn't really old. That you wrapped in some thing. It's like, no, that's actually been around a long time. We've been eating those for a while. How about we start like asking questions of these ancient peoples without assuming they're a bunch of dodos.
And Joel, if I can, because you've just prompted me by what you've just said, is that like the unwillingness to sort of tap into the wisdom that's all around us. This sort of like you said, the horse blinders that we just don't see. I had this experience. I lived in Los Angeles years ago, 15 years ago was when I first moved out there. And it was so funny because you're in LA. It's this so-called cosmopolitan area. I remember this gal that I work with, she wanted to know where I was from. And so I said, I'm from Springfield, Missouri. And she goes, ew. And I actually asked her where she's from. And she's like, well, I'm from Acton. I'm like, well, Acton is this little podunk town, like I think an hour from LA. I'm like, who are you to talk? But she said, ew, about Springfield, Missouri, not knowing anything about it. And I just thought to myself, you'd think that people living in California, sort of this international place, would have this international understanding. And it wasn't just her. I was blown away, Joel, by the parochialism of people who are sitting at the cusp of the sort of this international crossroads that people in Missouri, I think, may know more about the world because maybe they have to go outside of Missouri for their entertainment. But, I had a chance to, back in 2019, I went to Norway on a wonderful vacation, and I had these amazing experiences there, seeing the ways that people lived there that were so inspirational and so comforting. And it made me, I was like, oh, this is kind of what it's like when you run a nation with adults. It's kind of intriguing and not adolescents. But I think one of the shorts, the limitations sometimes of us as Americans is we're insular. Even though the world comes to us, we don't go to the world, right? And so there's a certain like insularity that comes with that we won't challenge ourselves, like to not know about some of the really cool things that people are doing in Norway and a ton of other countries is to not just simply dumb because we're not availing ourselves of all the wisdom that's been collected by other people. And you're just speaking to that in a more general sense that it's very unwise and short-sighted not to tap into the things that have been around for centuries, and they're right under your nose if we would just look for them.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And that makes me think of another question the book seems to ask. So,
Yeah.
the authors seem to me, at least, that to think that we are asking the wrong questions. That some will ask when did inequality in our system
Yeah.
begin? Like, when did that begin? And trying to like blame things, and they say that's the wrong question. The authors, instead of the origins of inequality, they ask, how have we lost our flexibility? Like, where is our flexibility and our political creativity gone? How are we still like stuck in the systems that rely on domination and violence? And they do a pretty beautiful job of painting how those things came into play, domination and violence
Yeah.
within our
Yeah.
political systems as a way to protect and maintain power. And I'm all about that. Like, I see that all at play. For that, they offer 3 freedoms that human societies used to exhibit. I wonder if you can share those with us.
Yeah, so this is a very important part of their book. It kind of forms kind of an invisible structure in some ways. They keep coming back. It's a motif, I guess, in their book. But so I want to get to that in just a second. But I want to preface it by talking about how the things that would impede the freedoms that we claim to have, like as Americans, that we want to have. So a lot of times when people say, well, we live in this huge world and it's so complex, we need all of these levels of hierarchy and bureaucracy. That's the way it is. If we lived in little hunter-gatherer bands, it could be much more simplistic. We wouldn't have coercion and domination. If you begin to look at the anthropological and archaeological record, you'll find some very, very interesting things. And I just want to give this one example because it's fascinating. So the seasonal changes in political organization that have been observed in a number of cultures around the world is fascinating. One with the Inuit, it's the opposite of what you would think. So there are like certain times of the year with a certain group of Inuit peoples in the polar region, northern regions, who at certain times of the year they'll get together in larger groups, and when they get together in these larger groups, it tends to be very egalitarian. There's not a lot of structures of domination. There's like these big, essentially wife swapping orgies that go on. Then for other parts of the year, they will set off in smaller bands. So they'll break down into smaller groups. Those groups will be ruled with an iron fist, basically, with very severe consequences by some sort of patriarchal character. And these are the smaller groups that we're supposed to be imagining is where all the freedom and hippie love is taking place. It's just the opposite. It's when they get together. And there's so many examples of this in the book that he talks about, where people get together in cities and it's not apparent that there are these structures of domination. How could that be if what we've always been taught is when you get together in cities, that's when you need to have the structures of domination? But okay, so on to the 3 freedoms.
That's fascinating, by the way.
What I just said, or isn't that cool, man? I mean, that just blew my mind. It's so cool.
Yeah.
So they, through their writings, through their investigations, they have uncovered sort of 3 freedoms that appear to have been very pervasive in human prehistory. Not always in play, but in play in a lot of places and for various epochs of our human history. And these are the 3 freedoms that people seem to assume, and you can kind of reverse engineer these things when you study them. And there are these. Number 1 is the freedom to disobey orders. The freedom to disobey orders. And I'll go maybe back into these a little bit, but I'll state them all. Number 1 is the freedom to disobey orders. Number 2 is the freedom to leave where you are, to move about freely, and to expect hospitality in the next town or tribe or clan that you show up in. That could be 10 miles, could be 1,000 miles. And the other freedom is the freedom to innovate political forms and forms of social organization. So freedom to disobey orders is something that seems to have been taken for granted, that in many of these tribes and groups of people and cities and so forth, it seems to for many peoples in large swaths of time that you just didn't tell people what to do. That was something that was so taboo that you just didn't do it. You did not tell people what to do, and that the power over people was not coercive power, but in many instances, you can see this in the records of Jesuit missionaries who were having lots of conversations, and colonials, French colonials, who were having conversations like in the 16 and 1700s with Iroquois and with Wendat and Huron. These people, these people from those tribes who were very great rhetoricians, it was very clear by interacting with them that in their tribes, that if you didn't have wonderful rhetorical prowess, people weren't going to do what you said just because you were the chief or you the head honcho. If you weren't entertaining and you weren't compelling and persuasive, they just weren't going to do what you said. And so you're sort of fucked. There wasn't that coercive power. It was just sort of taken for granted. The freedom to move freely. I mean, people were much more locomotive than we'd ever imagined. We think of human prehistory and sort of people just sort of, hunting and roaming around, and maybe they had sort of like a 10-mile radius or whatever it was. But it appears that people were well aware of how sort of big the world was. And there were people who undertook these very adventurous expeditions, sometimes for reasons we're not sure. Other times, maybe they were running away from danger, or their tribe had gotten sick of them, or they'd gotten sick of their tribe. Or maybe even from a biological evolutionary sense, there was this, you have a group of 40 people and you're all intermarrying. That's probably going to result in some situations. And so we might want to send people away so that we keep the gene pool somewhat mixed up. And so they were moving freely, so what went along with this freedom to move freely was the expectation, the obligation of providing hospitality to people who came to your town. So it went both ways. You couldn't enjoy that freedom unless you also observed the obligation to take care of people who came to you, and to try to integrate them into your tribe, or at least provide them comfort while they were there with you. And the other one, the freedom to innovate, that Graeber and Wengrow chronicle so many. What the phrase they use is that human history is replete with examples of this carnival parade of political experimentation. That's this great picture of the parade coming down, and all these sort of different looking characters, that early human beings were regularly experimenting with different ways of organizing themselves. And as I've already mentioned, the seasonality of this experimentation. And that could be even also not just with political organization, but that could be with the way that there could be times of the year when they did more farming, or years when they did more farming, and others when they did more herding, or when they did more foraging. So there was this great sort of play going on, this experimentation with how they fed themselves, with how they got together sexually, with how they decided that they would organize their households and their societies. We have become so ensconced and so ossified that in our political discussion today, Joel, if you talk about like the past century, it's sort of like it's either communism or fascism or like capitalism or democracy. These are sort of the only sort of things that we can even envision. That's how poverty-stricken our dialogue has become on these things.
Yeah, impoverished imagination for sure. Yeah. Like there's almost this acquiescence to the black and white thinking. People don't even feel like they have the energy to go like, what if there's more options? And this book is a doozy for sure. And it's not a book without controversy.
Yeah.
I did read a little bit about the controversies around some of the conclusions that they were making. Most of it kind of like smacked of what I've come to associate with the hair splitting of academia. Like some archaeologists, well, these bones found in Montana don't match the bones found in Canada based upon these three granular. And you're just like, how does that impact the big picture here? Which is what the books are kind of talking about. Now, maybe some of the dates and data is off a smidge compared to other interpretations. But what I think they're arguing, the main picture of it, is pretty
Yeah.
compelling. So,
Yeah.
for you, Trent, and we'll close with this.
So it
Why
is an altar call.
does. Oh, yeah. Close your eyes. Everyone, close your eyes. No one looking around, please. If you were to die tonight, Trent.
I love it. I love it. I'm getting chills.
I need. Just as I am without. Okay.
one.
Okay. So, why does this book light you up? Let us grab onto the coattails of your imagination, and you just go sprinting in the direction of what you're feeling here. Why does this book light you up? And we will like hang on tightly as you run.
Well, Joel, I don't imagine that in our world today, and when I say in our world today, I mean, I'm mainly thinking about like the United States. And then beyond that to maybe other parts of sort of like Western society and then the world. But when I say the world, I think of like the United States. I think there's a lot of happy people out there. There are people who are doing just fine. Life is working for them. And there's a lot of people that it's not working for. There's a lot of people who are really struggling to find human happiness and to flourish. There are many problems that we have as a society, but even let me just speak to, forget about all the problems. Let me just speak to the situation where people who are happy. You know, Sam Harris made a point. I hope I'm representing him correctly when I say this, but he's talking about like, when we talk about like morality, sometimes we get stuck just talking about like, well, if you've achieved happiness, that's fine. But like, what if we have no idea, Joel, how happy we could really become? And wouldn't that be a worthy goal? I mean, we want to obviously pull people or ourselves, if we're experiencing abject misery, we want to be pulled out of that. But like once we've gotten out of that, what about all the different ways that we could explore just how great human life could be? I don't think we spend time thinking about that. And I am one of those who gets excited about those things because I see all the ways that we live as human beings that aren't productive. I think about how we live in a society that is so hyper competitive, that is so fixated on acquiring and accumulating things, that thinks happiness is equivalent to owning things and displaying those things to other people. Just as a small example, or having some kind of weird arbitrary status based upon something that you've accomplished or whatever. But when you ransack the historical record in all of its fullness, you begin to see that there are many different ways that human beings have been happy throughout our history, ways that they're being happy around the globe today that we could be even more aware of. And if we could start to integrate those into our conversation, I'm not saying we can change things overnight, but if we can start doing the Christopher Nolan Inception and getting those seeds planting into our heads, into other people, we could start having more entertaining discussions. Like just a quick, for example, one of the things that I've hammered on that we've both talked about in previous podcasts is work, right? If I just announce to people, hey, what would it be like if we were to just all sort of come together as a culture and decide that we just thought 20 hours of work a week was about right? What kind of world might we have? Now, I don't know. There might be a lot of bad things, but we could also just that as a sort of a little thought experiment. The kinds of thought experiments that human beings, I can imagine, have had over many millions upon millions of campfires, over millions and millions of nights. Hey, what would it be like if we did something a little bit different this way? And just one thing I thought, if we worked 20 hours a week, I could talk to you more.
Yeah.
I could talk to my friends more. I could be outside and exercise more. Maybe healthcare costs would come down because people would be getting more exercise. Maybe our stress levels would go down because we're getting vitamin D and getting sunshine and exploring in nature. That's just one idea based upon the thought experiment of what if we fucking worked less. And by the way, so much of the work that's done, this has been well established in Graeber's previous book, Bullshit Jobs. So much of the work that's done in our society right now is so uncontroversially not necessary that it's mathematically quite realistic that we could work a 15-hour work week basically and get everything done that we need to. But we decided consciously as a society that we don't want to do that. And I just think what excites me about the book, Joel, coming back to it, is that it just gets the ball rolling for us as a society to have more productive, because more informed discussions about the kinds of things that we like and how we can get them, the kinds of things that we may not like and how to get rid of them, and how to go about doing those things. That's the cultural project. It's available for people who are intrigued by what we might be. If you're 100% content where you're at, which I suspect nobody is, then these wouldn't be intriguing. But if you have any sort of discontent at any point, there's there's this book and many other obviously resources there for you. This is a really good one, and it was very fruitful for me, as well as very very frustrating, because I want more people to join the conversation, and I get sad for our lack of desire to have these conversations, that people are just sort of on autopilot sometimes, and I want them to get excited.
Well, my friend, I have severely enjoyed your passion.
I totally monopolized this podcast, brother. I'm sorry.
That's right. The word seminary, it comes from that verb to inseminate. So you've been planting some seeds with your insemination, my friend.
Holy hell, Jesus. I don't know how I feel about that, but
oh well, it's
as long as you felt it.
The deed is done, as they say. Yeah, friends, I hope you really enjoyed our podcast discussing one of our favorite books, The Dawn of Everything. We really hope that you are enjoying our podcast. You can go to our website, www.leadballoonspod.com. You can also reach out to us if you have any ideas, or you want to comment on things, share some ideas, or maybe make some suggestions on the other things that Trent and I can discuss. That's leadballoonspodcast.com or at gmail.com. There it is. And, our website, you'll see there's blogs, there's links to all of the various platforms that we have our podcast on. Trent, any final words for us, my friend?
I think I've gone on quite long enough, so I'm gonna can it right there.
Canned. Well, friends, again, thanks for joining us for Lead Balloons, the Alchemy of Unpopular Opinions. Until next time.
Peace.